Just off their top 5 singles alone, that's over $840,000 they've made off of Spotify. Off a 20-year-old album that they haven't sold any copies of in forever. What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we're going to take on one of those timeless debates like Coke versus Pepsi, Mac versus PC, Ohio State versus Michigan. Today we're going to take on the topic of physical media like vinyl, cassettes, CDs versus digital like downloads and streaming. And with people right now looking to spend their money wisely as well as support the artists they love, I'm going to look at it from both angles. Which is the better value for listeners, and also what's best for artists? I'm gonna do my very best to answer that in this video. And if you notice that I'm wearing a different outfit later in this video, well, there's a reason for that. It's because this video is actually an upload of something I published about a week ago that was, well, let's just say not well received. And I will take 100% of the blame for that. It was originally uploaded with a title and a thumbnail that in hindsight came off as a lot more like antagonistic and aggressive than I intended. So my bad on that, and please understand that none of this should be taken as an attack on anyone or their hobbies. It's just a friendly discussion of the pros and cons of each option. And before I get into it, first, please check out the Punk Rock MBA podcast if you haven't. There's a link to that in the description. And with that out of the way, let's get into it.
I found my James Brown record filed under the J's instead of the B's. I don't know who taught you to alphabetize.
First of all, you should know that I get it. I used to love physical media. When I was in like junior high and high school growing up in the suburbs of Seattle, my favorite thing to do was go into the city on the weekend and just spend a whole day digging through all my favorite record stores. If you are old like me and you're from the area, then you'll remember like Fallout up on Capitol Hill, Second Time Around in the U District, and anything I couldn't find digging through the crates at those record stores, I would mail order. And mail order back then was very different from what it is now, where you go on Shopify or whatever, put in your credit card details and it arrives a week later. Oh no. Mail order back then in the 90s meant that you saw some like tiny little classified ad in the back of like Maximum Rock and Roll or Metal Maniacs or something. You put cash in an envelope, sent it to some stranger across the country or across the world, and hoped that maybe in a couple weeks or a couple months, maybe you might get something back. It's always a roll of the dice as to whether they would just rip you off or not.
So it's been about 2 weeks and we have had no sign of the mystery box.
I put a ton of time and money into collecting, and you know, I didn't have the biggest or craziest record collection in the world, but mine definitely didn't suck. And more importantly, I had a ton of fun putting it together. And a couple years later, like in my 20s, I got pretty into collecting retro video games. Like at one point I had 3 PC Engines, 2 Sega Saturns, including a Japanese one that was modded with a country switch, a Dreamcast, this modded PS1, which I think still works. I haven't played in a long time, and as of now has a burned copy of the Japanese Fist of the North Star game in it, to give you an idea of how deep into this shit that I was. My point is that I get the appeal of physical media. I was bitten by the collector bug too. But my friends, it's time to move on. Reason number 1 that I hear people cite for buying physical media is that they like the experience better. Meaning like sitting down and being able to look at the artwork and something bigger than like a little thumbnail on your phone, read the liner notes, listen to it from start to finish in the order that the artist intended. And I get it. I mean, as a kid, I was super into drawing and I spent hours and hours and hours looking at the cover art for bands like The Accused, Septic Death, White Zombie, copying the entire cover of Earth AD by Misfits. And I loved the liner notes and thank you lists too. Like one of the best ways to discover new bands back then was to look at who was on the thanks list of a band that you already liked. Oh, the guys in Operation Ivy are always talking about this band called Green Day. I guess I should probably check them out. That said, if it's about the artwork, well then selling vinyl or CDs doesn't really make sense, right? Because if you're selling vinyl so that people have a larger version of the artwork and maybe they can hang it up on a wall, then the vinyl is kind of just a glorified poster then, and why not just sell posters? It just seems very wasteful to me to sell an album that realistically will probably never be listened to at all, or maybe listened to once or twice, just so that people can have a larger printed version of the artwork. And I get that collecting stuff can be fun because, like I said, I used to do it, but the older I get, the more it just kind of seems like a big waste of space to me. Aside from that PS1 I showed you, I have like, I don't know, 3 or 4 like games and consoles sitting in a box somewhere. I got rid of all my books and CDs and records and shit years ago. On the other hand, I have friends that have like shelves and shelves of this stuff. They have like an entire room of their house dedicated to like their vinyl and comic collection. And hey, if that makes you happy, that's cool, go for it. But to me, that just seems like a big hassle, especially because we live out here on the West Coast where it's just pretty expensive and you probably don't have a lot of extra space for anything, let alone a hobby.
The only thing more expensive than buying a house in Seattle is renting.
But that being said, there is one place where streaming has definitely had a negative impact on my experience of listening to music, and that is that it's made my attention span a lot shorter than it used to be. If I'm being honest, these days I'm a lot less likely to give something a second chance as compared to when I was a kid with physical media. Back when I could only afford to buy like 1 or maybe 2 albums a week, first of all, I would definitely listen to that whole thing start to finish. Like that's the first thing I would do when I would get home, is like sit down and listen to the entire thing, reading the lyrics, looking at the liner notes along the way. And even if I didn't like something right off the bat, I would give it a second, third, fourth chance and try to find the good in it. I would try to like it because, I mean, I spent $8 on this, which when you're 15, that's a lot of money, right? So I really wanted to like it, and I would put in the time and effort to try to understand and grow to like something, even if at first it didn't grab me. And that got me into some stuff like, for example, Atheist and Pestilence that at first were a little bit too weird for me, but after listening to it a few times, I kind of got to understand it, wrap my head around it, and now I love it. Whereas now, first of all, I really never listen to a whole album from start to finish. And second, if a song doesn't grab me in the first, maybe 30 to 60 seconds, I just skip it and move on to the next thing. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying that's how it is. And I think a lot of other people are kind of in the same boat because it's so easy. Like this song, skip, maybe you'll like the next one. And so I do think there's something to be said for physical media there because it makes you slow down and really digest the entire piece of music. That said, I really do think on balance, the overall experience of downloading or streaming is better. Having instant access to pretty much everything ever recorded on this thing that I carry around in my pocket versus like putting tapes in my backpack like I did when I was in high school or one of those clunky old CD wallets. To me, that's the easiest choice I could ever make. I went all digital as soon as I could. Like as soon as I got an MP3 CD player in my car back in, I think like 2001, that's it. I bought maybe 10 CDs since then. Never looked back.
Don't you understand? This is important to me.
And reason number 2 is I buy physical media because I want to own my music. I don't want to rent it. And so the logic here is, well, I don't like streaming because the problem is that there's no guarantee that you will have access to this stuff forever. For example, I noticed that maybe like a month or 2 ago, Leeway's first 2 albums suddenly disappeared from Spotify for what I guess are some sort of legal issues. Or sometimes you'll see there's like 1 or 2 songs on an album that are grayed out. Again, I don't know why, but I would assume some sort of contractual thing. Whereas if you buy the physical media, well, then you have it forever, right? Like nobody's ever gonna come into your house and erase that song off the CD or take the LP out of your hand. Like, sorry, these guys got in a dispute with their label, we're taking away your album. So there is some truth to this one. Yes, things can and do get removed from streaming services, but first of all, how often does that actually happen? I think it's pretty rare. On the other hand, how many times does your physical media get lost or damaged or stolen? I don't know about you, but I probably lost dozens of albums over the years. So yes, you do own the music, or more accurately, you own this one copy of the music, but that doesn't really mean much if the CD gets scratched or someone sits on it in your car and it cracks in half, right? For example, a lot of the records that I lost are stuff that I got like 15 or 20 years ago that was on obscure DIY labels, like a lot of old like death metal and slam and grind. And that stuff's gone forever because these were on obscure little DIY labels that never bothered to put this stuff on any streaming platform. It's so small that nobody ever even ripped it and put it on YouTube. So yeah, I suppose that I owned that stuff, but did I really? Because I don't have access to it now, even though I paid for it 20 years ago. Owning a physical copy of something does not necessarily mean that you will have access to it forever. You only have access to it for as long as you are able to hold on to that piece of media and that it doesn't get damaged. Whereas with Bandcamp or iTunes or whatever, if you lost your phone, well, that sucks, but all you have to do is log into your account again, download it, and boom, you're back in action. So all in all, I would say if your goal is to have permanent access to your music, I would say digital is actually a better way to do that than physical media.
Because I don't give a shit. I mean, who cares about what's on the flip side of a record?
I do!
And number 3 is I buy physical media because it supports the artist. This is one that I hear a lot, and I understand why, because sort of at first glance it does make sense. Like if I buy a CD for $10 and it costs like $1 to make that CD, great, that's $9 of profit in the artist's pocket, right? Well, not exactly. For one, if you're buying that at a record store and this artist is on a label, you really have no idea how much of that money is actually ending up in the artist's pocket. That depends on a lot of things. For example, how many different middlemen there are in the equation. There's the retailer, there's the distributor, there's the label, and by the time that actually gets to the artist, a lot of people have taken a cut and the artist may see very little or even none of that. And second, because of all the things I just mentioned, there's actually a much lower profit margin in physical media than there is for digital, especially with vinyl. So let's say in the best case scenario, you're buying vinyl directly from the band at a show and they pressed it DIY, so you pay $20 or whatever for the album, and they might have a 40 or 50% profit margin there on a per unit basis. That's pretty good, but it's not nearly as good as digital. If you buy it on iTunes, the band is gonna get 70%, iTunes takes a 30% cut, or if you buy it on Bandcamp, depending on what like pricing tier they're at, they're gonna get something closer to like 90 or 95% profit. So actually buying digital is the best way to directly support the artist. If you watch the interview I did with Aaron Marshall of Intervals, he talks about this quite a bit. He said that actually his biggest source of income is Bandcamp. Plus, there's no guarantee that the physical release of the album overall is profitable for the artist because it's very, 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 very easy, as anybody who's put out their own record will tell you, to end up sitting on like boxes and boxes of unsold units that end up wiping out the profits from anything that you do sell. And the data backs up this idea of physical media being not really that important for supporting artists. If you look at music industry revenue as a whole, it's way up, but the vast majority of that is from streaming. Physical media sales only make up about 15% of overall revenue, according to this Wall Street Journal article, with streaming accounting for about 80% and growing. Another point that is super, super important, which I never really hear people bring up, is that streaming is ongoing, recurring revenue for artists, whereas physical media is just a one-time source of revenue. Meaning that, again, if you buy a CD from an artist at a show, they make, $5, $6, or $8 off it, whatever it is, that's great, but because it's a one-time transaction, they will never get another penny of revenue from you for that piece of music, whereas on the other hand, streaming can potentially monetize that piece of music forever, long after they stop selling the record. One example of this that really caught my attention was the 2000s butt rock band Saliva, the click, click, boom guys. They sold a shitload of that album back in the day. That album went double platinum in like 2001 or whatever, but I can't imagine that they're selling a ton of CDs today. And that kind of sucks because, they wrote this hit song that people still love. Shouldn't they be able to continue to monetize that? Well, that's where streaming comes into play. And look, they've got over 200 million streams on Spotify. Don't ask me how. I'm not sure who is listening to Click, Click, Boom 100 million times, but apparently they're out there. And if we assume a rate of around $4,000 per 1 million Spotify streams, and remember, this is just Spotify, this is not even taking into account Apple Music and Amazon and anywhere else they may be monetizing it. Just off their top 5 singles alone, that's over $840,000 they've made off of Spotify. Off a 20-year-old album that they haven't sold any copies of in forever. And so if you care about the financial welfare of artists, that's amazing, because it means they'll continue to get paid for their music forever as long as people are still listening to it. So just to kind of bottom line this section as far as what is the best way to support artists, well, to me, it's super clear. The answer is digital. Yes. And reason number 4 that I hear people say is I buy physical media because it sounds better. And again, just like the other ones, there's a little bit of truth here, but really only a little bit. That's especially the case if we're talking about vinyl, which I know a lot of people love on kind of an emotional level, but if we're being objective, it sounds pretty bad. And that's just because of the physical limitations of this format, which is 100 years old now. And on top of that, because it's a mechanical format, it wears out. Like every time you play an album, you're literally making it sound worse. Now, if you enjoy the sound of vinyl, great, that's your personal preference, but speaking on a purely objective level, it's really pretty far from the best in terms of quality.
Okay, just don't touch my records. Ever.
Now, as far as CDs go, well, that's another conversation. These do objectively sound better than anything other than lossless streaming. However, there are a couple pretty big buts here. First of all, high quality MP3s like Spotify's 320K high quality streaming option sound very, very, very close to lossless, to the point where most people can't tell the difference between the high quality MP3 and lossless audio in a blind listening test. And the high quality MP3 definitely sounds better than vinyl or cassette. And second, even if CDs do sound a little bit better than high quality MP3s, most of the time you're listening in an environment like the car or the gym or the bus where ambient noise kind of makes that irrelevant.
No, you know what? I don't think I'm selling it this week. Maybe next week.
Oh no, you said that last week.
And like I said, I was focusing on music in this video, but I think it's mostly true of games as well. I mean, this game is great. But what's not great is hanging on to a bunch of jewel cases from 20 years ago. I would way rather just be able to buy this on PSN and never have to think about it again. So that does it for this video about physical media. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you agree or disagree with the 4 points that I brought up? Is there something I missed? Is there another point that I'm not thinking of? And reminder, if you haven't, please check out the Punk Rock NBA podcast. It's live now on all platforms. There's a link to that in the description. I also want to thank everyone who supports us on Patreon, especially those who support a true cult level or above. It is because of your support that I was able to get the podcast off the ground. I wanted to do it for a long time. I didn't have time, but because of you guys, I was able to hire a producer and editor who is the key to getting this whole thing off the ground. So I sincerely appreciate your support very much. If you are interested in supporting on Patreon, there's a link to that in the description. Patrons get a bunch of stuff. They get all the podcasts a week early. They get an audio-only podcast feed of all my main videos. There's an opportunity for me to review your band or YouTube channel or podcast or any other creative project that you might have. There's a Discord channel. So yeah, if you're interested, there's a link to that in the description. Also, before I let you go, one last thing. If you want to talk about business with me, add me on LinkedIn. I'm going hard on LinkedIn right now because there's a lot of cool stuff happening over there. If you add me, you'll see why. There is a link to that in the description as well. And with that, I will sign off for now, but I will see you next time.